The night my father set my suitcase on the porch so my sister could turn my room into a wedding storage suite, he did not know he was throwing out the only person standing between this family and a financial collapse. By the time the rain touched my face, I already knew one thing with terrifying clarity. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. For hours earlier, the sky above Charlotte had been the color of bruised steel, low and swollen, pressing itself against the glass towers downtown as if the whole city were holding its breath. I sat across from my regional director in a conference room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and dry erase marker, and watched his mouth shape the kindest version of a brutal sentence. Restructuring. Position eliminated. Severance package. Continued benefits through the end of the quarter. I heard every word. I absorbed none of them at first. The folder in front of me looked too thin to carry the weight of 8 years. 8 years of late nights, impossible clients, budgets stitched together with discipline and nerve. 8 years of being the person who fixed what everyone else let crack. I folded my hands in my lap to stop them from trembling. Across the table, Victor looked pained, almost ashamed. He was trying to be gentle. I knew that. But gentleness does not change the blade. It only softens the handle. I thanked him. That was what competence looked like in its final hour. What I did not tell him was that my real future was not sitting in that folder. It was waiting in another file, in another office, with another name on the door. The company I had quietly built on weekends and red-eye flights was days away from being sold. The offer on the table would change everything. My family did not know. No one in my family ever knew what I carried until they needed it. By the time I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house in Matthews, the porch light was already on. The kitchen windows glowed gold against the deepening blue outside, warm and familiar in the way dangerous things often are. I sat in the car for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, letting the silence settle around me. I told myself I would go in, tell them the truth. And maybe for once they would hear it as my truth, not as a problem to solve for themselves. The smell of rosemary chicken hit me the second I opened the door. My mother, Judith, always made meals that looked like comfort and felt like expectation. The dining table was set. The television was off. My father, Martin, sat already waiting, broad shoulders rigid, fingers laced together in front of him. My sister, Lila, was scrolling through her phone, one heel bouncing nervously beneath the chair, the diamond on her left hand catching the light every time she moved. I sat down and said, "I have news about work." My mother looked up too quickly. My father straightened. Lila finally lifted her eyes. I said, "They eliminated my position today." And just like that, the room changed. Not toward me. Away from me. Lila inhaled sharply, not with sympathy but with alarm. Her face tightened, then hardened with the speed of a slammed door. Who is going to cover the final venue payment now? The question hit the table like broken glass. I stared at her. For one suspended second, I honestly thought she might hear herself and pull it back. Apologize. Ask if I was all right. Ask if I needed anything. But she only looked at me with rising panic, as if my grief had interrupted the schedule for her floral arch and imported linen runners. My mother set down her fork with maddening care. "Honey, you know how stressed your sister is. We are so close to the wedding and everything is already in motion. Everything is already in motion." My father exhaled through his nose, that familiar sound he made when a decision had already been made somewhere inside him and all that remained was enforcement. "Naomi, you are resourceful. You always land on your feet. Lila needs the house right now more than you do. Her planner needs space. The vendors have started deliveries. It makes the most sense for you to stay somewhere else for a while." Somewhere else. The phrase was clean. Efficient. Bloodless. I felt my heartbeat slow instead of race. That was the strange thing. The deeper the cut, the calmer I became. I looked at my mother, who would not meet my eyes for more than a second at a time. I looked at Lila, whose fear was entirely for herself. I looked at my father, already rising from the table. He went upstairs to pack for me. That was the moment. Not the words. The movement. My father had entered my room maybe 3 times in the past year. Once to fix a lamp. Once to move a dresser. And now he climbed those stairs with the grim authority of a man relocating an inconvenience. Drawers opened. Hanger scraped. A zipper split the air upstairs. My mother kept talking in that soft padded voice, the one she used when she wanted cruelty to pass as reason. This is temporary. It is just until things settle down. Lila said nothing more. She did not have to. Her silence was greedy enough. When my father came back down, he carried my suitcase without looking at me. He walked past the table, past the framed family photos in the hallway, past the coat rack, and set it outside the front door beneath the porch light as if that settled the matter. Rain whispered against the driveway. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and went quiet. I stood, picked up my bag, and felt something inside me go still. Not shattered. Still. Cold steel still. Because while they were stripping me down to the role of unwanted daughter, they had no idea who I actually was. They did not know that in less than a week, I was supposed to sign papers that would make me a very rich woman. They did not know I had already arranged, in secret, a way to erase the loan hanging over this house and the venue debt strangling my sister before she even walked down the aisle. I had come home ready to hand them relief. Instead, they handed me a suitcase. And standing there under the thin yellow porch light, rain needling my skin, I understood with a clarity so sharp it almost felt holy that some doors do not close on you. Some doors reveal exactly who was waiting on the other side. Ethan Cole lived in a 3rd-floor walk-up in South End, in one of those old brick buildings that still carried the bones of another decade beneath the polished renovations. The first thing he did when he opened the door and saw my suitcase was not ask questions. He stepped aside, took the bag from my hand, and said, "Come in before you get soaked through." That was Ethan. No performance. No panic. Just space. His apartment smelled like cedar, black tea, and the faint mineral warmth of rain drying on window glass. A low lamp burned in the corner of the living room, turning the room amber. I stood just inside the doorway for a second too long, clutching the strap of my purse as if I still had somewhere else to be. Ethan looked at my face once, took in everything I was trying not to show, and disappeared into the kitchen. By the time I sat down on his couch, there was a mug in front of me. Strong tea. A folded towel. A blanket draped over the armrest. Kindness arranged so quietly it did not feel like pity. I told him everything. Not dramatically. Not all at once. I laid the night out piece by piece, the way you empty broken glass from your hands. The conference room. Victor. The folder. The drive home under a sky the color of dirty metal. My mother smoothing the tablecloth while my life split open in front of her. Lila asking about the venue payment before she asked if I could breathe. My father walking upstairs to pack my things like he was clearing away clutter before company arrived. Ethan sat across from me in his worn leather chair, elbows on his knees, listening with the kind of stillness that makes truth sound louder. He did not interrupt. He did not soften it for me. He let the story arrive in the room exactly as it was. When I finished, the apartment was very quiet. Rain slipped down the windows in thin silver veins. Somewhere below us, a motorcycle coughed to life and faded down the street. Ethan looked down at his tea for a moment, then back at me. "Naomi," he said, very gently, "you have never been treated like a daughter in that house when money was involved. You were treated like the emergency generator. Quiet until the power went out. Essential only when everything else failed." The words landed harder than the eviction had. Because they were true. There are truths that hurt because they are cruel, and there are truths that hurt because they unlock a room you have been trapped inside for years. I sat there with the mug warming my palms and felt something inside me shift, something old and tired finally named. I thought of being 17, standing in the fluorescent gloom of a grocery store after school, counting crumpled bills from my apron pocket. My father had been drowning then too. Different debt. Same silence. I had slipped money into the house in tiny invisible ways back then. Paid a utility bill once. Covered a pharmacy pickup another time. Bought groceries and said there had been a discount. No one asked how. No one thanked me in a way that meant they understood the cost. Relief had always been accepted in that family the way air is accepted. Necessary. Expected. Unremarked upon. And because I had learned early that being useful was safer than being fragile, I had built my whole adult life in secret. I set the mug down and told Ethan the rest. About Harbor Lane systems. About the revenue platform I had helped build from the ground up while everyone assumed I was simply working late for someone else's dream. About the offer from the travel tech firm in Denver. About my controlling stake. About the number that still felt unreal even in my own head. More than enough to remake a life. More than enough to save a house. More than enough to rescue a wedding from its own vanity. Ethan's face changed then, not with greed, not even with surprise exactly, but with a sharp, sober understanding. He leaned back slowly. They have no idea, do they know? I said. My voice sounded almost calm. They do not. I told him about the clause I had planned to activate. The private arrangement through my attorney. The money set aside to clear my parents' loan and erase the final crushing costs of Lila's venue before the wedding folded in on itself. I had imagined revealing it over dinner. My mother crying. My father finally seeing me. Lila, for once, with no clever answer ready. Instead, they had pushed me out of the house to make room for centerpiece mock-ups and garment bags. Ethan dragged a hand over his jaw and let out a slow breath. Then maybe, he said, they made your decision for you. The sentence entered me like cold water. Not because I wanted revenge. That would have been simpler. Cleaner. Hotter. What I felt was stranger than revenge. It was the first hard edge of clarity. I slept on Ethan's couch that night under a gray wool blanket while the rain tapped lightly at the windows. But before I closed my eyes, I opened my banking app and stared at the quiet architecture of my own support. The insurance draft I had been covering for the house. The internet account in my name. The automatic transfer that had been cushioning a gap no one ever bothered to explain because I had already filled it. My thumb hovered over the screen. Not yet, I thought. But soon. And in the dark, with the city breathing softly outside and my suitcase resting by the door like proof of a death I had not expected, I understood something with a steadiness that frightened me. I had spent years being the floor beneath people who never once asked whether I was cracking. The next morning, Charlotte wore the dull silver face of a city trying not to feel anything. The streets were wet from the night before, the glass towers downtown blurred at the edges by a thin mist, and the sky hung low enough to make every building look smaller than it was. I left Ethan's apartment just after sunrise with my laptop in my bag, my hair still damp at the ends, and the strange calm of a woman walking toward a decision that had already begun forming long before she admitted it. Simon Vale's office sat on the 22nd floor of a building in Uptown, all slate walls, clean lines, and the kind of silence money buys on purpose. His receptionist greeted me with professional warmth and led me into a conference room with a long walnut table and windows that overlooked the city like a judgment. Simon was already there, sleeves buttoned, pen aligned perfectly beside a stack of folders. He was the kind of attorney who never wasted a word and never missed the one that mattered. He looked up when I entered, and something in my face must have told him this was not an ordinary meeting. Rough night, I gave a small breath that was not quite a laugh. Something like that. He did not press. He only nodded and slid the first folder toward me. The acquisition was clean. The due diligence had closed without complication. The intellectual property transfer had been finalized. The offer from the Denver firm still stood exactly where it had stood the day before. Solid. Precise. Real. Simon walked me through every page in his calm, measured voice, but under the legal language another rhythm was beating inside me. The memory of my father's footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the zipper opening my suitcase. Lila's voice, sharp with panic, asking about her venue payment before she asked if I was all right. My mother smoothing the situation with the same hands she had used my whole life to make selfishness look like order. Then Simon reached for the second folder. It was thinner. 3 pages only. White paper. Black ink. A simple instrument carrying the weight of years. The family relief provision. My eyes landed on the first line and stayed there. In the stillness of that room, I could almost see the version of myself who had drafted it. The loyal daughter. The efficient fixer. The woman who had spent so much of her life preventing disaster for other people that she had started calling it love. If activated, the clause would route a protected portion of the sale proceeds into escrow. Enough to reduce the pressure on my parents' house. Enough to rescue Lila's wedding venue from the edge of collapse. Enough to spare them consequences they had not earned relief from but had fully expected, in some unnamed future, I would somehow erase. Simon rested one hand lightly on the folder. If you want it executed, he said, this is the point. I picked up the document. The paper was cool between my fingers. The language was elegant in the way good legal language is elegant, stripped of emotion, leaving only structure. I read every line even though I already knew it by heart. Beneficiaries. Escrow mechanism. Disbursement sequence. Release triggers. All of it clean. All of it ready. And all at once I was back at the dining table. I saw Lila's ring flashing in the light as she asked who would pay. I heard my father tell me I was resourceful, as if resilience were a debt I owed the world. I saw the careful angle of my mother's face, the way she would not hold my gaze for more than a moment because deep down she knew exactly what she was doing. They had not asked whether I was frightened. They had not asked where I would sleep. They had not asked what losing my job had done to me inside. They had simply rearranged me. Like furniture, like a cost, like the one thing in that house that could be displaced without ceremony. A strange stillness came over me then. Not rage. Rage burns hot and bright. This was colder than that. Clearer. It felt like stepping out of a room that had been suffocating for years and discovering the air outside had been waiting all along. I set the document back on the table. Remove it, I said. Simon did not blink. He only studied my face for a beat, giving me the courtesy of one final silence in case I wanted to rescue the old version of myself. I did not. You are sure? Yes. One word. Flat. Final. He drew the folder back, opened it, made a note in the margin with one neat motion, and placed the document in a separate stack. No speech. No warning. No moral theater. Just the efficient closing of a door. We finished the rest of the paperwork in less than an hour. I signed where I needed to sign. Initialed where I needed to initial. Dates. Clauses. Representation statements. My hand stayed steady the whole time. When the meeting ended, Simon stood and gathered the folders into precise, ordered piles. As he walked me to the door, he said, almost gently, sometimes the most expensive thing a person can do is keep offering rescue where there has never been any gratitude. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time that morning something in my chest loosened. When I stepped back outside, the city air felt cooler, cleaner. Cars moved below in patient streams. A construction crane turned slowly against the white sky. Somewhere across town, my family was probably still speaking of me as a problem to be managed, a temporary disruption, a woman who would come around because she always did. But they did not know what had just happened in that room. They did not know I had removed the hand that had been reaching toward them. They did not know the future they had assumed was already theirs had quietly vanished. They did not know that this time, when they looked for the floor beneath them, they were going to find open air. I stood there for one long moment with the wind pressing lightly against my coat and realized I did not feel cruel. I felt lighter. By the third week, silence had begun doing what anger could not. It exposed structure. I was in my furnished studio in Noda on a gray Thursday afternoon when Ethan sent the screenshot without a caption. I looked down at my phone and saw Lila's face next to a long public post written in the wounded, theatrical tone she reserved for moments when she wanted sympathy without accountability. She was complaining about the wedding venue, about hidden fees, about predatory contracts, about people who promised support and disappeared when things got hard. I read it once, then I set my phone face down on the counter and stood very still. The studio was small but clean, with pale wood floors and one tall window overlooking a narrow courtyard where a pair of neglected planters sat in the rain. The radiator clicked softly behind me. A kettle hissed on the stove. Everything in that room belonged to me, or at least to my choice. That mattered more than I had words for yet. I picked my phone up again and read the post a second time, more slowly. People who promised support. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the sentence was so expertly inverted it deserved admiration. I had not promised support. I had embodied it for years so consistently that they had stopped seeing it as something given at all. In my family, what I provided became invisible the moment it became reliable. My labor, my money, my steadiness, my restraint. All of it had been absorbed into the architecture of their lives until they mistook it for foundation poured by God. Now the concrete was gone, and they were calling the crack unfair. Ethan called a few minutes later. I answered on the second ring. "You saw it," he said. I did. He was quiet for a beat. Then, carefully, "Martin has started asking questions." That got my attention. About what? About the house? About the payment history? About why certain bills suddenly feel heavier than they used to? He ran into me outside a hardware store this morning and looked like a man trying to do math with half the numbers missing. I turned toward the window. Rain was feathering the glass in fine diagonal lines. Down in the courtyard, a delivery driver in a blue jacket crossed quickly with a cardboard box tucked under one arm. Life moved. Packages arrived. Water fell. Somewhere else, a family system was beginning to understand it had confused maintenance with magic. "What did you say?" I asked. "Not much. Just listened." He mentioned the venue too. Apparently Lila is behind on another installment she never told them about. There it was. The extra fracture. I closed my eyes for a moment and saw the whole thing as clearly as if someone had drawn it across the inside of my skull. Lila had not only overreached. She had lied about how far. My mother had likely known enough to worry, but not enough to stop it. My father, who believed problems stayed small if spoken about in a controlled voice, had probably discovered too late that silence is not the same thing as order. And beneath all of it, for years, there had been me. Quietly filling the gaps. Covering the drift. Softening impact before anyone else had to feel it. Not anymore. That evening I received the email from Simon. The subject line was short. Wire confirmed. I opened it at the small kitchen counter with one hand wrapped around a mug gone cold. The number sat there in black and white, clean and astonishing and final. After fees, after taxes, after every signature and correction and waiting period, the sale had closed. The money was real. Not abstract. Not pending. Mine. For a moment the room seemed to tilt, not with dizziness but with scale. My whole adult life had been built in narrow corridors of control. Stretch the paycheck. Manage the risk. Plan for the worst. Keep enough tucked away to survive other people's bad decisions. And now, in one quiet email, the horizon blew open. I sat down at the tiny table by the window and stared out at the courtyard until the screen dimmed. I should tell the truth and say that part of me thought immediately of the house in Matthews. Of my mother at the kitchen sink with her mouth pressed thin. Of my father at the dining table with bank papers spread around him. Of Lila, frantic and indignant, still trying to turn consequence into victimhood. But the thought did not own me the way it once would have. It passed through. It did not root. An hour later Ethan came by with takeout and a bottle of sparkling water because he knew I would not feel like celebrating loudly. We ate at my tiny table, knees almost touching, curtains open between us, the room filled with the smell of ginger, garlic, and sesame oil. He asked whether I felt happy. I thought about it seriously before answering. Not happy, I said. Free, maybe. He nodded as if that made perfect sense. I told him about Savannah then. About the consulting role becoming something larger. About the apartment listings I had started browsing near the historic district, where old brick buildings met river light and Spanish moss hung from trees like soft green weather. I talked about leaving Charlotte entirely. About building a life in a place where no one had known me as the woman who would always cover the shortfall. Ethan listened, smiling a little, but not enough to turn the moment sentimental. And your family? He asked quietly. I looked down at my hands. I think, I said, for the first time in my life, they are going to have to meet themselves without me standing in between. The words settled over the room like a truth that had been waiting to be spoken aloud. 3 days later, Ethan texted me again. Your dad is on my front steps. I stared at the message. Read it twice. Then a third time, slower. Outside my window, the rain had stopped. The courtyard stones gleamed darkly in the late afternoon light. Somewhere nearby a siren rose, then faded. I typed back. Is he angry? No, Ethan replied. Just tired. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. Because that was the thing about my father. Martin Carter did not go to other people when he was angry. He went when he had run out of places to hide from what he knew. And for the first time since he carried my suitcase to the porch, he had come looking for me. When I pulled up outside Ethan's building, my father was sitting on the front steps with both hands flat on his knees, as if he needed to keep them there to stop them from shaking. The late afternoon light had gone thin and colorless. It drained the brick walls, the sidewalk, even his face. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. Not dramatically. Not like a man in a hospital bed or under sudden catastrophe. Older in the quieter, more terrible way. Like someone who had spent too many nights discovering that the life he trusted was being held together by forces he had never bothered to name. He stood when he saw me. That reflex struck me harder than I expected. That old reflex of manners. Of order. Of being the kind of man who rose when a woman arrived, even if he had once watched his own daughter leave with a suitcase and done nothing to stop it. Ethan opened the building door before either of us spoke. He gave us the living room and disappeared down the hall with the clean discretion of someone who understood that privacy is sometimes the last dignity left in a hard conversation. My father sat in Ethan's worn leather chair. I took the couch across from him. For a moment neither of us spoke. The room held the soft amber light of early evening. Somewhere in the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed. A pipe clicked in the wall. Ordinary sounds. Gentle sounds. They made what was coming feel even sharper. My father cleared his throat. Things have gotten complicated, he said. I almost smiled at that. Complicated. As if the truth had arrived wearing a polite coat. He talked first about the house. About the loan pressure. About notices he did not fully understand. About payments that had changed in ways he could not explain. Then he talked about Lila. About the venue debt being larger than they had been told. About another installment due. About your mother being upset. About stress. About the wedding. About everything except the one thing that mattered most. He still wanted to circle the wound instead of touching it. So I let him speak until he ran out of edges. Then I said, you are not here because things got complicated. You are here because they stopped being easy for you. The words landed. He looked at me, and something in his face tightened, not with anger but with recognition. I know you have been helping, he said quietly. I just did not know how much. No, I said. You knew enough. You just never asked for the full shape of it because not asking was more comfortable. He looked down at his hands. The room went still. I had imagined this moment in flashes over the past few weeks. In some versions, I was colder. In others, crueler. But sitting there with my father looking suddenly like a man made of fatigue and habit and late understanding, I felt no appetite for cruelty. Cruelty requires heat. I was past heat now. What I had was clarity. So I gave him the truth. I told him about being 17 and slipping grocery money into the cracks at home. About bills I had quietly covered. About the years of automatic transfers and invisible cushioning. About Harbor Lane systems. About the company I had built while everyone assumed I was merely working long hours for someone else's success. About the sale. About the money. He stared at me as if each sentence was rearranging the room around him. Then I told him the part that mattered most. I had a clause drawn up, I said. Before that dinner. Money set aside. Enough to help with the house. Enough to deal with Lila's venue debt. I was going to tell all of you that night. His face changed. Not dramatically. My father was not a dramatic man. But something seemed to go out of him and sink lower, like a structure settling after a beam has been removed. You were going to help us, he said. Yes. And then I called my attorney the next morning and removed the clause. He closed his eyes. That silence was the heaviest one yet. It filled the room all the way to the corners. Not because he had no words, but because at last words would not save him from understanding. When he looked at me again, his face had gone pale beneath the dusk. I have been doing this to you for years, have I not? It was not really a question. It was the shape of a confession arriving too late to disguise itself. Since I was a teenager, I said. Since the first time this family learned I would bleed quietly if it kept everyone else standing. He pressed his hand over his mouth for a moment and looked away. Outside, a car rolled past with its music low and distant. Somewhere above us footsteps crossed an upstairs floor. The world kept moving. I found that comforting. Pain feels less absolute when the rest of life refuses to stop for it. My father lowered his hand. What happens now? There it was, the real question, not what do I feel, not how do I forgive you, what happens now? I could have answered 100 ways. I could have listed all the damage. I could have told him about every night I had mistaken overfunctioning for love, every year I had confused endurance with worth. Instead, I chose the truth that mattered most. Now, I said, you handle your life without assuming I will absorb the impact. He nodded once, slowly, like a man swallowing something rough. I told him I was leaving Charlotte. I told him about Savannah. About the consulting role. About the apartment I had found near the river where the light turned gold in the evenings and the trees wore long silver moss like old thoughts. I told him I had already decided. That part seemed to hurt him almost more than the money. Maybe because departure is the one consequence no apology can immediately fix. When I stood, he stood too. He looked as though he wanted to say he was sorry, and perhaps he was. But some people arrive at remorse the way others arrive at foreign countries. Late, disoriented, and unable to speak the language well. I did not make him struggle through it for my sake. I gave him the name of a loan counselor. A number to call. A place to begin. Not rescue. Direction. At the door, I said, take care of yourself, Dad. Not we will fix this, not tell Mom I love her, not tell Lila I understand. Just that. He nodded again. His eyes were wet, though he would never have called it that. Then he walked out into the cooling evening and down the steps, carrying the full weight of himself at last. 3 days later, I was at the airport before sunrise with one suitcase, one laptop bag, and a coffee too hot to drink. The terminal glowed softly in the half-light. People moved around me with the private urgency of departures. A child laughed near the gate. A woman in a navy coat folded and refolded her boarding pass. Beyond the glass, the runway lights burned impatient lines through the morning haze. I sat by the window, opened my laptop, and began writing the first 90-day plan for my new role in Savannah. That was the moment it truly hit me. Not when the money came through, not when I removed the clause, not even when my father sat in Ethan's living room and finally saw me. It hit me there, at the gate, with the cursor blinking on a blank page and the future waiting in front of me without asking me to carry anyone else inside it. I had not stopped loving my family. I had stopped financing the version of them that required my exhaustion to survive. And there is a difference. A profound one. A holy one. If you have ever been the person who fixed everything so quietly that people forgot you could break, then you know this kind of leaving is not cruelty. It is self-respect arriving at last with its shoulders back and its voice steady. If Naomi's story touched something in you, leave a comment and tell me when you first realized being the strong one had become a cage. And if you want more stories about quiet power, hard truth, and the kind of justice that arrives without shouting, like this video and subscribe to Waters Payback.